He sat alone at the corner table, wrapped in an old green jacket that didn't match the quiet power in his shoulders. From the doorway, you would have thought he was just another tired man hiding behind dark glasses, trying to drink his coffee in peace. Steam curled from the paper cup in his hands as the city's morning rush hummed outside the windows. Inside the café, the light was soft and golden, touching the rows of croissants and the faces of people lost in their phones. Only one person really looked at him, Sophia, the young waitress with a black apron, ink stains on her fingers and exhaustion hiding beneath her practiced smile. She'd seen enough people come and go to read them in a second. The man in the cap and sunglasses didn't fit with the Thursday crowd. His clothes were simple, almost worn, but there was a stillness in him, a kind of quiet that didn't belong to ordinary, hurried strangers. When he ordered, his voice had been gentle, almost careful, as if he was afraid the words might land too hard on the counter. "Just a black coffee, please, and how's your day going?" Most customers didn't ask that. Most customers never looked her in the eye. Sophia had answered with her usual half-truth, the one she gave to keep her tips steady. "Busy, but good," she'd said, sliding his change back. What she didn't mention was the rent due in 4 days, the bus pass that had just expired, and the phone call she'd ignored from the hospital because she already knew the bill would be more than she could pay. She moved through the cafe like a dancer on a floor full of broken glass, light, fast, careful not to show the pain. As she wiped a nearby table, her coworker Louis nudged her with his elbow. "You see who that is?" he whispered, jerking his chin toward the man in the corner. "I'm telling you that's him, just with a beard and a cheap jacket. I saw some pictures online. He does this sometimes." Sophia followed his gaze, studying the man again. The jawline, the way he held himself, the slight hesitation before he smiled at a little boy who nearly bumped into him. Something flickered in her memory. Movie posters on the bus stop. A face on the TV in the bar her father used to watch late at night. She shook her head quickly. "Even if it is him, what does it matter?" she muttered. "Famous or not, he's still just another customer. He'll tip if he wants to, or he won't." But as she said it, she felt a strange mix of irritation and curiosity curling in her chest. If it really was him, why was he dressed like that? Why was he alone? Why did his shoulders look like they were carrying something heavier than a hoodie and a cheap cap? A few minutes later, when the rush eased, Sophia carried the refill pot over to his table. "Free refill," she offered softly, her hand steady even as her heartbeat quickened. He looked up at her, and for a brief second the glasses couldn't hide the recognition in his eyes, the realization that she knew, or was at least dangerously close to knowing, who he really was. His lips parted as if to say something honest, something real, but he hesitated and chose the safer words instead. "Thank you," he said. "You're very kind. Not everyone here looks this awake." His attempt at lightness was clumsy, but there was warmth beneath it. Sophia poured the coffee, fighting the sudden urge to ask him directly to rip the mask away. "Why are you hiding? What are you doing here, sitting in my broke little life, pretending to be invisible?" Instead, she leaned a little closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. The words came out before she could stop them, sharpened by late nights and unpaid bills and the way celebrities existed like distant planets, while people like her burned up in silence. "You know," she whispered, her smile still politely fixed for anyone watching, "tips are only fine for some of us." His hand froze around the cup. The casual disguise he wore, baseball cap, sunglasses, unshaven jaw, suddenly felt flimsy, like paper in the rain. Something in her tone had cut straight through the anonymity he'd come here to hide inside. He looked up, really looked at her for the first time, and saw the tremor at the edge of her bravery. For a heartbeat, the cafe noise faded. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of plates, the low murmur of conversations. There was only her challenge hanging between them and the question he'd been trying to outrun for months. What good was his quiet kindness if it never reached the people standing right in front of him? He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the door burst open and a group of teenagers rushed in. One of them stopping mid-step, eyes wide, staring straight at him as if recognizing a ghost beneath the cheap black cap. The kid froze in the doorway, clutching his skateboard, his gaze locked on the man in the cap like he'd just stepped into a movie scene. For a second, his lips moved without sound, testing a familiar name, almost saying it out loud. The man's hand tightened around his coffee cup, and beneath the table his foot began a slow, nervous rhythm against the floor. He hadn't planned on staying long enough for anyone to really look at him. That was the whole point of the jacket, the glasses, the quiet corner. Sophia watched the boy's eyes flick from the man's face to the faded movie poster on the cafe's bulletin board, some old action film someone had pinned up as a joke. Recognition flashed, quick and electric. She saw it and felt a knot tighten in her stomach. If the kid said the name, the whole cafe would turn. Phones would come out. Whispers would swell. Whatever fragile truth had just opened between her and the stranger would drown under a wave of selfies and shaky excitement. "Table for you guys?" she called, stepping into the line of sight with a forced brightness that surprised even her. The teenagers blinked, attention breaking for a moment as she motioned them toward a booth on the opposite side of the room. "We've got space over here. Happy hour on muffins if you're hungry." It was the first lie she'd told all morning. There was no muffin happy hour. There was only the instinct to protect a man she didn't owe anything to, yet somehow felt responsible for. As she handed them menus, she could feel him watching her. When she came back to his table, the silence between them felt heavier, more complicated. He lifted his glasses just enough for her to see his eyes clearly this time, tired, grateful, and carrying a depth that didn't belong to someone who lived an easy life. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. "I know," she replied, setting the refill pot down and crossing her arms, more to steady herself than anything else. "But you also didn't have to hide in a place where people can barely afford to be invisible." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with her own resentment at a world where some people could choose anonymity like an outfit, while others were forced to disappear by poverty, by debt, by circumstances they never asked for. He breathed out a quiet laugh, not mocking, more like he'd been caught. "Fair point," he said. "I'm trying to remember what normal feels like, trying to see people without them seeing all of that." He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if fame were just another billboard outside. Sophia's chest tightened. "Normal," she echoed softly. "Normal is counting coins before you order coffee. Normal is wondering if you should eat breakfast or save it so your little brother can have dinner. Normal is hoping your manager doesn't cut your hours because someone else is more flexible." Her voice broke on that last word, and her cheeks flushed with sudden embarrassment. She didn't talk like this to customers. She barely talked like this to herself. He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the cafe blurring around them. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia." He stopped himself, swallowing the name the world knew. For a heartbeat, she saw the conflict flicker across his face, a man torn between honesty and the fragile safety of being nobody. "I'm Mark," he finished, choosing the lie that hurt less. The disappointment that pricked at Sophia's heart surprised her with its intensity. She had just helped him stay hidden, and still, it stung that he didn't trust her with something as simple as his real name. But then again, she understood the instinct to protect whatever you had left. In her case, it was her dignity. In his, it was his privacy. "So, Mark," she said quietly, "what did you think I meant when I said tips are only fine for some of us?" He leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "I assumed," he said, "that you meant people expect tips instead of fair wages, that it's a broken system, that some of you are hanging by a thread while others drop a few dollars and feel proud of themselves." Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "But it's more than that. Tips are unpredictable. Some days a stranger's kindness makes the difference between groceries and going hungry. Other days you give your best and people treat you like you're invisible, like your time, your patience, your smile don't matter. That kind of uncertainty, it wears on you. It makes you feel like your worth changes depending on who walks through that door." His fingers traced the rim of the cup, slow and thoughtful. "And you think I'm one of the people for whom tips are always fine?" he asked, voice steadier than he felt. "I think," she said carefully, meeting his eyes, "that people like you can disappear into a crowd if you want to. You can walk in, walk out, and forget this place 5 minutes later. But I'll still be here tomorrow, hoping the math works out." She paused, then added quietly, "And yes, if you are who I think you are, your tip doesn't just pay my bills, it says you see me, or that you don't." Her words slid under his skin like a truth he'd been avoiding. He'd always prided himself on being kind, signing autographs when he was exhausted, listening to strangers' stories, giving up his seat, writing checks to causes that broke his heart. But sitting here in this small cafe with its flickering light and worn countertops, he suddenly realized how often his kindness had been easy, scheduled, expected, a nice story for someone else to tell. Before he could respond, the manager's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Sophia, you done having heart-to-hearts or you planning to start a therapy practice in my cafe?" The man at the register, Lucas, with his too sharp jaw and habit of counting every second his staff wasn't moving, stood with his arms crossed, irritation flaring in his eyes. "Table 7's been waiting. Move." Sophia flinched, the fragile shard of honesty between her and the stranger shattering as reality crashed back in. "Coming," she called, forcing her face back into the neutral mask he expected. She stepped away from the table, the distance between them suddenly feeling bigger than the length of the room. The man watched her go, watched the way her shoulders hunched just a little when she turned her back, how quickly she swallowed her own feelings to keep her job. Every step she took felt like a question he couldn't stop hearing. What good is your goodness if it doesn't cost you anything? He slipped a hand into his pocket, fingers brushing his worn wallet, then the crumpled envelope he'd been carrying for days. A check meant for a charity, one he'd promised a friend he would support. He hesitated, pulse picking up. The decision forming in his chest felt reckless, too personal and dangerously honest. But as Sophia apologized to Table 7 for the delay, her voice strained but still kind. Something in him solidified with a quiet, stubborn certainty. He looked down at the envelope, then back at her, and knew that if he walked out now with just a polite tip and a grateful smile, he would carry the weight of that choice far longer than any disguise. He reached for a pen, pulled the check from the envelope, and began to write something that would change both of their lives. Right as the teenager with the skateboard stood up, turned toward him again, and this time, with a trembling, excited voice, spoke his real name out loud. The name hung in the air like a dropped glass. Conversation stuttered. A spoon clinked too loudly against ceramic, and then nothing, just the sharp, stunned silence that comes when everyone realizes they're breathing the same moment together. The teenager's voice cracked with disbelief. "It's you, isn't it? You're Kia?" He didn't even finish. He didn't have to. Half the cafe had already turned. Chairs scraped. Someone gasped. A phone camera rose, shaking. Another followed, then another, like a dozen small spotlights finding their mark. He felt the familiar wave crash over him, the mix of excitement, need, and hunger in strangers' faces. The part of him that wanted to run curled tight in his chest. But across the room he saw Sophia freeze in place, coffee tray balanced on one hand, eyes wide, panic flickering across her expression. This was her workplace, her fragile ecosystem. Chaos here didn't just mean noise, it meant mistakes, complaints, maybe hours cut, maybe worse. He stood slowly, raising his hands, palms open, his voice steady but gentle. "Hey, guys," he said, as if they were a small gathering instead of a potential storm. "Yes, it's me, but I'm kind of off duty today, just trying to drink my coffee and not ruin anyone's shift, okay?" The teenager's face flooded with color. "I'm sorry, man, you're my hero. You helped me when I was going through some dark stuff, your movies." He cut himself off, embarrassed, shoving his phone back into his pocket. His friends exchanged looks, unsure if they should crowd closer or back away. "So you think he's more important than our orders now?" A woman at table 9 muttered loudly enough for the whole cafe to hear. She waved her receipt in the air. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for my latte." Lucas, the manager, saw his opening. "Sophia," he snapped, seizing the moment to deflect the tension. "You see what happens when you stand around chatting? This is what I mean when I say focus. Go fix table 9 before we lose more customers." Sophia's cheeks burned. She set the tray down a little too hard, one cup sloshing over the edge. "I'm on it," she said, biting back the sting in her throat. The murmurs, the cameras, the pressure, it all pressed down on her, reminding her she wasn't allowed to break, not even for a second. From across the room, he saw it, the way Lucas used her as a shield, the way blame slid onto shoulders that were already carrying too much. Something inside him tightened. The world loved him here in this moment. Her world could turn on her for being caught in it. He turned to the teenager first. "Hey," he said softly, stepping closer so he didn't have to raise his voice. "Come talk to me after, yeah? I'd like to hear that story. No cameras, just you and me. Deal?" The boy nodded, stunned, and sank back into his seat. A few phones hesitated and lowered. Curiosity, for now, was still stronger than entitlement. Then he walked back to his table and picked up the envelope and the half-filled check. The pen felt heavier in his hand. He looked at the charity's name, the line where the amount should go, and then at Sophia, who was apologizing yet again to table 9, shoulders tight, smile brittle. He thought of all the times he'd written checks from a comfortable distance, galas, fundraisers, red carpets where generosity came with applause. He thought of this small café where one unexpected act of kindness could shift the ground under someone's feet for years to come. And he thought of what she had said, tips are only fine for some of us. He drew a quiet breath, then crossed out the charity's name with one long, deliberate line. In its place under pay to the order of, he wrote slowly and carefully, Sophia Alvarez. His heart thudded in his chest as he added a number on the amount line that made even his pulse stutter, more than enough to clear medical bills, more than enough to erase rent worries for a long time, more than enough to give someone like her something she'd never been allowed to really have, room to breathe. He signed his name, this time without hiding it. When Sophia finally turned from table 9, Lucas was already there, blocking her path. "This is a business, not your personal confessional," he hissed under his breath. "If I see you flirting with customers or slowing service again, I'll knock your hours down next week. You understand?" Her spine stiffened. "I wasn't flirting," she said quietly. "I was just explaining why tips are only fine for some of us," he mocked, repeating her words with a smirk. "Careful who hears you say things like that. You want to work here, you play by my rules. The world isn't fair. Get used to it." His words cut, but they were nothing she hadn't already told herself in darker hours. Still, hearing them out loud from the man who controlled her schedule felt like being shoved closer to the edge of a cliff she'd been trying not to look down from. She stepped around him and moved toward the corner table, intending to clear it so he could finally leave, finally take the spotlight with him and let her day go back to the quiet misery she at least knew how to navigate. But when she reached the table, the chair was empty. On the saucer beneath his half-finished coffee cup, there were two things, a folded napkin with writing on it and the signed check, the numbers almost unreal on the paper. Her breath caught. For a second, the whole world narrowed to that small rectangle in front of her. She didn't touch it. Couldn't. Hands shaking, she picked up the napkin first. A simple line stared back at her, written in a hurried but careful hand. "For the days when tips aren't enough, please don't let anyone tell you your worth depends on them." Her knees nearly gave out. She felt someone step up beside her. Lucas. His eyes had already latched onto the check, and whatever warmth he'd ever had in him was replaced by something sharp and hungry. "What's this?" he demanded, reaching for it. Sophia's hand shot out instinctively, palm slamming down on the paper before he could grab it. For once, she didn't think about rent, or shifts, or how easily he could fire her. Her reaction came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that remembered every time her mother's overtime pay had mysteriously gone missing. Every time a boss took advantage because they knew desperation made people quiet. "That's mine," she said, voice low but steady, eyes burning into his. "He left it for me." Lucas scoffed. "You really think you can just walk out of here with that kind of money because some actor had a nice morning? This is a place of business. Anything left on the table goes through me. It's policy." There was no such policy, and they both knew it. The room felt smaller, air thinner, awareness of the watching customers prickling the back of her neck. Some pretended not to notice, but their eyes kept sliding back, unable to look away. The teenager with the skateboard half rose again, uncertainty written all over his face. For the first time in a long time, Sophia's fear met something stronger, a fragile, rising sense of dignity she hadn't felt in years. She straightened, keeping her hand firmly over the check. "No," she said quietly, the word trembling but unbroken. "What's left as a tip belongs to the staff. You've said that 100 times when it suits you. This is no different. This is mine." Lucas leaned in, voice a harsh whisper. "You really want to fight me on this, Sophia? You think anyone here is going to back you up when I say you were stealing?" Her throat tightened. He could do it. He could twist the story. People like him always could. The risk hung in front of her like a blade. But behind that fear, another image rose, her mother in a faded uniform, saying, "One day you're going to have to decide if your dignity is worth more than your safety. I hope you never have to make that choice. But if you do, I hope you remember who you are." Her heart hammered until she could hear it in her ears. Customers watched, phones hovered. The check under her hand felt like fire. She swallowed hard, met Lucas's eyes, and with a courage that scared even her, said the one thing that could not be taken back. "If you try to take this," she whispered, voice shaking but clear, "I quit." The cafe went absolutely silent. For a long, crushing heartbeat, no one moved. Lucas's face darkened and Sophia braced herself, knowing that whatever he said next would decide not just her shift, not just her job, but the direction of her entire life. For a moment, all she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears. The cafe lights felt too bright, the air too thin. Lucas stared at her like he was seeing a stranger, not the girl who picked up extra shifts whenever he asked, who covered for coworkers when they were sick, who stayed late without complaint. His mouth curled into a tight, mocking half-smile. "You quit," he repeated, savoring the words. "Over a piece of paper you don't even deserve? Fine, then you can leave right now. I'll make sure every cafe on this block hears about your little stunt. See how long that check lasts when no one wants to hire you." The threat landed like a punch. For a second, Sophia almost broke. She thought of the hospital bill, the letter on her kitchen table about overdue rent, her little brother's shoes with holes in the soles. Walking away from this job was like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee there was ground below. Then she felt the thin edge of the check under her palm and remembered the words on the napkin, "Please don't let anyone tell you your worth depends on them." For the first time, the voice in her head wasn't just her own fear. It was someone else's belief in her, quiet but unshakable. "You can say whatever you want," she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. "But we both know what this is. You're trying to take something that was never yours. That's on you, not me." A chair scraped loudly to her left. The teenager with the skateboard stood up, pushing his hair from his face, eyes blazing. "She's right," he said, louder than he probably meant to. "I saw him leave it. He signed it. He wrote her name. It was for her." A murmur rippled through the cafe. Another voice joined in, an older woman at table 3 who'd been quietly reading a paperback all morning. "Tips belong to the staff," she said firmly. "You can't just change the rules because it's a big tip. That's stealing." Lucas darted a glare around the room, suddenly realizing just how many witnesses he had. Phones were still out, not just pointing at the door where the actor had left, but now at him. His jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being the one under the lens. "This is a private matter," he snapped. "Everyone mind your own." The bell over the door chimed softly. Sophia's head turned instinctively. There he was again, cap still on, glasses still shading his eyes, but there was no longer any hope of anonymity around him. He'd clearly stepped outside, realized what was happening through the glass, and come back. The room seemed to draw a collective breath as he walked toward them, each step measured, controlled. He could have left. He didn't have to return, but he had. Lucas straightened, forcing a smile. "Sir," he began, his tone suddenly oiled with politeness, "there seems to be a misunderstanding about." "There's no misunderstanding," the man said quietly, his voice cutting through the room without needing to rise. He looked at Sophia first, then at Lucas. "I left that check for her. The words are very clear. It belongs to her, not your cafe, not your policy." The room held still. He could have stopped there. It would have been enough. But something in his eyes said he was done doing the bare minimum kindness, done staying safe. He stepped closer to the counter, removing his sunglasses slowly like he was shedding the last layer of pretense. Recognition hit the room like a spark. A few soft gasps, a whisper of his name threaded through the air, but he didn't turn to the attention this time. His gaze remained fixed on Lucas. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If I'd left $5 on that table instead of this check, would you still call it company money?" Lucas hesitated. The answer was obvious. "That's different," he insisted weakly. This is an unusual amount. It's not really a tip, it's more like a donation." "No," he cut in gently but firmly. "It's a thank you, it's a recognition, it's what I can give today to someone who reminded me I don't live in this world alone." His voice softened as he turned to Sophia, and for a second the cafe and the cameras and the expectations all fell away. "You were honest with me when you didn't have to be. You tried to protect my privacy and you told me the truth anyway. You stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to stay silent. That's rare." I wanted to honor that, not make your life harder. Sophia's throat tightened. You already have, she whispered, half laughing through the ache, glancing at Lucas, who was simmering with frustration and the sudden realization that he was wildly outmatched. I just quit. He studied her for a second that felt like the space between heartbeats. Then maybe, he said slowly, you're already on the path you were supposed to be on. The teenager with the skateboard stepped closer, hopeful but hesitant. Sir, he asked, eyes darting between them, can I say something? He nodded once. Sure, what's your name? Diego, the boy said. Look, I know this is your day off or whatever, but I've seen your interviews. You always talk about being grateful, about remembering where you came from. If this lady, he gestured clumsily towards Sophia, is brave enough to risk everything for what's right, and you're standing here saying you want to help, maybe this is one of those moments you always talk about, the ones that actually matter. The words hit harder than any scripted line ever had. He smiled faintly, almost painfully. You're right, Diego, he said. This is one of those moments. He turned back to Sophia, voice quieter. Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. She swallowed and nodded. If money weren't the first thing you had to think about every morning, he asked, what would you do with your life? The question stunned her. No one had asked her that in years. Not her teachers, not past bosses, not even the few friends who'd stuck around. Life had mostly been about survival, not dreaming. She stared down at the check under her hand, at the napkin with his message, then up at him. Behind him, she could see the reflection of herself in the cafe window, tired eyes, frayed apron, fingers ink-stained from jotting grocery lists she never quite fulfilled. I'd go back to school, she whispered at last. I wanted to study social work or maybe psychology. I used to think I could help people like my mom, people who worked themselves to the bone and still couldn't get out. I wanted to, I don't know, build something better than this. Her gaze flicked around the cafe, not with hatred, but with a kind of gentle sadness. But then my mom got sick, and bills got bigger, and dreams got smaller. He nodded slowly as if something inside him was clicking into place. Then use it, he said simply. Use the check, pay the bills that are suffocating you, and when you can breathe again, go after that, please. That's the only thing I want in return. Her eyes burned. Why, she asked, the word tearing out of her. Why me? You don't even know me. Because someone once did the same for me, he answered, and the cafe leaned in as he spoke. A long time ago, when I was completely lost, when I thought I was going to drown under grief and mistakes, someone saw me. Not the version of me in posters, just me. They gave me a chance and told me to use it well. I've been trying to pay that forward ever since. But somewhere along the way, I started doing it from too far away, through foundations, events, numbers on a screen. Today. You reminded me that the most important kindness is the kind where you know the name of the person you're helping. He paused, swallowing. And I do know your name, Sophia. I wrote it on that check. I meant it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of emotion, of unspoken gratitude, of people reevaluating the lines between strangers. Even Lucas seemed uncertain now, the edges of his anger softening under the weight of so many eyes, so much unmistakable clarity. He looked at Sophia, then at the crowd. Just to be perfectly clear, he said, a hint of steel entering his voice, that money belongs entirely to her. If anyone tries to take even a cent of it, I'll make sure every lawyer I know makes their life extremely complicated. We understand each other. Lucas's throat bobbed. Of course, he muttered, backing away from the counter. This was all a misunderstanding. Sophia is free to keep whatever he left. He tried to sound gracious, but it came out strained and small. Something in Sophia finally loosened. For the first time all day, her shoulders dropped slightly, like a weight had slid off that she'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it really was. She lifted her hand from the check, picked it up carefully, and pressed it to her chest for a moment, more like a lifeline than a lottery ticket. Thank you, she said, voice shaking, to the man in the cap. Not just for the money, for standing here, for not pretending you didn't see. He shook his head softly. Don't thank me yet, he replied. Thank me if a few years from now you look back and this was the moment you decided your life belonged to you again. He slipped his sunglasses back on, but there was a gentleness to the gesture now, not a wall, just a shade. Before turning to leave, he glanced at Diego. "You still want to talk?" he asked. The boy nodded eagerly, eyes shining. "Then walk with me," he said. "We'll find somewhere quieter, no cameras." He looked around the cafe one last time and added, "And maybe be a little kinder to the people who carry your coffee, yeah. They're fighting battles you don't see." A quiet, rippling agreement moved through the room. Some nods, some lowered eyes, a few murmured, "Yeah." From people who'd suddenly become painfully aware of every rushed order and impatient sigh they'd ever given. The door chimed as they stepped out into the street. Him, the world-famous stranger in the worn jacket, and Diego, the teenager who dared to speak from his heart in a room full of adults. The noise of the city swallowed them quickly, but their absence left a strange, glowing echo in the cafe. Sophia stood there for a long moment, check in one hand, napkin in the other, her apron suddenly feeling like a costume she'd outgrown. Lucas retreated to the back, muttering about inventory. The other customers slowly returned to their lattes and laptops, but the air wasn't quite the same. Their glances toward the counter were softer now, edged with a new awareness. The woman with the paperback approached the register. "Sweetheart," she said gently to Sophia, "when you decide what to study, you're going to be incredible at it. Don't let this place be the last thing that defines you." She slid a $10 bill into the tip jar and gave Sophia's hand a quick, firm squeeze before leaving. Sophia exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since the first time she'd put on an apron. She looked down at the check again, reading her own name over and over, almost convinced it would vanish if she blinked too long. It didn't. The numbers stayed. The ink stayed. The possibility stayed. In the shifting quiet of the cafe, she reached behind her neck, untied the black apron, and folded it carefully. There was no bitterness in the motion, just a calm, fragile resolve. She placed it neatly on the counter and picked up her worn backpack from the hook by the door. As she walked out, the bell chimed one last time. The morning light caught her face, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel like she was slipping behind. She felt like she was stepping forward. On the sidewalk outside, the city moved as if nothing monumental had just happened behind that glass. Cars passed. People hurried by. Somewhere down the block, she could just make out a small cluster of fans giving respectful space to a man in a cap, as a boy with a skateboard spoke to him with earnest, animated hands. She watched, unnoticed, for a heartbeat longer. His laugh floated back on the wind, light-free. Sophia smiled, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "All right," she whispered to herself. "Let's see what happens when tips aren't the only thing keeping me standing." She turned away from the cafe and started walking, not toward the bus stop that took her home in exhausted circles, but toward the library 3 blocks down, where she knew there were computer terminals and college application forms and information about scholarships she'd always been too tired, too scared to ask about. Each step felt less like running away and more like running toward something. Toward nights spent studying instead of counting coins. Toward mornings where her value wasn't measured in tips and fake smiles. Toward a life where she could sit across from someone else's pain one day and say, with the authority of her own scars, "I see you. You're not alone. You're worth more than what the world has offered you so far." Back in the cafe, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, the hum of conversations. But something small and invisible had shifted. A manager thought twice before snapping at his staff again. A regular left a little more in the tip jar, not out of guilt, but out of a new understanding. A teenager, later that afternoon, told his friends about how his hero had listened to him, really listened, and he quietly promised himself to do the same for others. And somewhere in the city that night, a man who could have stayed a myth stared at the ceiling of his modest apartment, replaying the way Sophia's hand had shaken over that check. The way her voice had trembled when she said, "I quit," and felt something inside him settle, like he'd finally, after all these years, honored the gift once given to him. Kindness, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures alone. It was about seeing the person standing right in front of you and being willing to let their courage change you, too. In a world where tips were only fine, for some, one ordinary morning had become a turning point. For a waitress reclaiming her future, for a celebrity reclaiming his purpose, and for everyone who'd witnessed it and left with a quiet, persistent question echoing in their hearts. When someone shows you who they are, their struggle, their bravery, their worth, will you pretend not to see, or will you answer with your own courage? The answer, as Sophia stepped into the library and pushed open the heavy glass door, was beginning to write itself.